the amount of time we've had things that we can recognize as dictionaries is really about 300 years or so. Before then, you had various dictionary-like things you would have from the oldest period of English, pre 1000 or so. You had glossaries of Latin and Old English scribbled in margins of manuscripts and things like that. From the 15th century onward, you had more elaborate things. You had glossaries, either manuscript or published dictionaries, translating Latin or French to English. And in the 16th century, you had these dictionaries of special subjects. So agriculture was a big one, seafaring, rhetoric, but not general dictionaries such as we understand them. You don't start seeing dictionaries that resemble modern ones until really the early 18th century. So some of the early ones, John Kersey's New English Dictionary of 1702. This, for example, was the first dictionary to include the word girl. The entire definition was a wench. years or so. Before then, you had various dictionary-like things you would have from the oldest period of English, pre 1000 or so. You had glossaries of Latin and Old English scribbled in margins of manuscripts and things like that. From the 15th century onward, you had more elaborate things. You had glossaries, either manuscript or published dictionaries, translating Latin or French to English. And in the 16th century, you had these dictionaries of special subjects. So agriculture was a big one, seafaring, rhetoric. But not general dictionaries such as we understand them. And in fact, even when the first monolingual dictionaries appeared, the first one in 1604, Robert Caudry's A Table Alphabetical, in which he spent quite a bit of time in the introduction discussing the process of alphabetization, how to look up words, that if you have a word that begins with CA, you look at the first part of C, but if it begins with CU, you go to the last part of C, which was necessary at the time. The whole concept of dictionaries at this point were just devoted to hard words. So, Caudry's dictionary had words that were hard but actually used, but some of the later 17th century dictionaries were words that were not used at all, words that never appeared in English, just these elaborate Latin words with these elaborate definitions. And the whole point was for people who were, a newly literary class, being able to learn the hard words of the language, the alleged hard words of the language, that they would never see. Of course, they couldn't see, these weren't real words, but they could feel better about themselves. They're learning hard words. This is how lawyers speak. This is how professional people speak, and these are the words you should know. You don't start seeing dictionaries that resemble modern ones until really the early 18th century. So some of the early ones, John Kersey's New English Dictionary of 1702. This, for example, was the first dictionary to include the word girl. The entire definition was a wench. But nonetheless, the point is that before then, before 1700 or so, the idea of having a dictionary that would include the words that you already know, there was no point to this. We know them. There's no need to look them up. And in fact, this is a concept one still sees nowadays. You often, well, not often, but there are dictionaries out there that are just devoted to hard words because we know the other ones. We don't need them. And here are ones usually for the purpose of impressing people or with humorous definitions. But back then, that's all they had. Nathan Bailey's Dictionarium Britannicum of 1730, very different dictionary, much larger, and some of the features you see then in dictionaries of this period, again, the common words were in. You would have these esoteric Latinisms in the 17th century dictionaries. These were specifically excluded. You would have an emphasis on science and industry. This was the most important thing of the time. The idea that nowadays, internet and computers and all this, like now we care about scientific vocabulary, they were really concerned about scientific vocabulary at the time. And in their prefaces of these dictionaries, they would spend a lot of space talking about industrial terms and mining terms and agricultural implements and how these were treated in the dictionary and how you could learn things from them. But they were just as concerned with technology then as we are now. And the dictionaries reflect that. Illustrations for the first time. And etymological information, which again, as in Webster at this point, the etymologies were completely worthless. Really, it isn't until the mid-19th century that etymologies and dictionaries were useful at all, but they were in there. The first really great dictionary we have is Johnson's Dictionary of 1755, which most people will have heard of, maybe only as a joke in a Blackadder episode. Johnson's dictionary didn't actually do anything completely new. Everything that's in Johnson was in some other dictionary in some form, but usually not very well done. One of the things that Johnson did, he had a tremendous number of illustrative quotations. So not only would he have a definition, but he would have examples from usually major authors showing how these words were used. And in Johnson's dictionary, there were about 100,000 of these, and that's a tremendous number. A full third of these were from Shakespeare, Milton, or the King James Bible, showing how important he thought these authors were, and also helped cement their reputation at the time. He had treatment of polysemous entries as ones with multiple senses. Before then, you typically would have a word, and you would just have one definition covering every sense that word might have. Johnson split things up into many different senses. I'll show an example in a sec. And usage labeling, so that words that were technical or that were considered slang would have a label indicating that. Now, a great definition a great example rather of how we do this In Bailey's dictionary of 1730, the entire definition for think was to meditate, suppose, or be of an opinion. That's it. Johnson's entry actually went on somewhat longer than this, but he broke it up into 8 or 9 different senses, different senses, and these were illustrated with many dozens of quotes from Locke, Dryden, Addison, the King James Bible, Shakespeare, Swift, and more. And it's hard to convey just how great this was. I mean, this is an absolute masterpiece of analysis, not least because no one had done this beforehand, so you couldn't see how someone else did it and said, oh, well, I'm going to change these things or add another sense. This is all his. It's really an incredible effort to do this. Meanwhile, in America, Noah Webster, he had earlier works, but the great work was the American Dictionary of the English Language. Webster was from a very respected but poor family. He was connected to some of the most important people in the early 17th century colonies. He went to Yale during the Revolutionary War and tried unsuccessfully to work as both a lawyer and a schoolmaster, but he had great success with the American Spelling Book, which first came out in 1783. This was the best-selling book in the 19th century, apart from the Bible. It sold, estimates of how far the American Spelling Book sold in the 19th century run to around 100 million copies. And Noah Webster did a lot of other important things. He helped establish copyright law. He founded the first daily newspaper in New York City. If he hadn't written a dictionary, he would still be very important. But the dictionary itself is a great thing. And he was he was strongly jingoistic. He thought American English, he coined the term American English as Noah Webster's coinage. And he very strongly thought that American English was a separate thing than from British English, needed to be treated separately, needed its own dictionary. Webster's dictionary had a number of great features. Again, like many of the early ones, a lot of scientific and technical terms, included Americanisms for the first time, so plantation, levee, coyote, squash, skunk, prairie, these are terms from Spanish, French, Indian languages, quotations from American authors, great definitions. Johnson had very good definitions, but Johnson's skill was in other things. Webster was a really great definer. So Johnson's definition of the word label, for example, was a small slip or scrap of writing. Not too bad, you get the idea across. Webster's was a narrow slip of silk, paper, or parchment containing a name or title and affixed to anything denoting its contents. This is a good definition. Noah Webster was a great definer. And the Brits in particular who have guided the debate over this, all think that Webster was just copying from Johnson, which he did, but in fact, Webster on his own was a much better definer than Johnson. Nonetheless, Johnson in England and Webster in America were regarded as the great dictionaries, and for a long time there were no serious attempts to produce anything scholarly that would supplant them. But by the middle of the 19th century, scholars started to realize that we needed something new, that they needed something new. And the idea that the things that led to what became the Oxford English Dictionary were planted at this time, the seeds. In 1857, the Philological Society in London, which was a scholarly organization, started. Richard Chenevix Trench, the Dean of Westminster, later Archbishop of Dublin, presented a series of papers arguing called On Some Deficiencies in Our English Dictionaries, a great history of English dictionaries up to that time, which not only discussed the problems with them, but the solutions, what we needed to have in a dictionary that would fix all these problems. So some of the things that he suggested were that obsolete words should be treated well, not just ignored because they were too old. That citations, the quotations showing how these should be used, they shouldn't just say Shakespeare or just have a quote without indicating where they're from. They should be accurately dated so you could tell how old these words were and when they had been used. The sources should be wide-ranging. It shouldn't just be literary sources. Johnson was almost entirely using literary authors. The OED, what became the OED, said that, everything, technical sources, newspapers, anything. And that the lexicographer, the role of lexicography was not as a moralist telling you how you should speak, but as a historian saying, this is how the language works. This is how the language has always worked. Here's how things have been spoken, and we are just reporting on it. Trench's chalk was met with great enthusiasm. There was a lot of preparation done. It took a long time before the dictionary started to appear, But the historical method is the important thing about this dictionary. And as an example of how this works, here's the entry from a modern entry. This is the entry from Oxford Dictionaries Online, our main, the basic dictionary, not the OED, for the word skyscraper. It has a pronunciation. This is a complete entry. There's no etymology. There's just a pronunciation.